Um, Without further ado, I'll pin the screen to us. Okay, back on.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and pleasure to have you hosted for breakfast. I know I think most faces here are very familiar. I'll get since I've only allowed 3/4 of an hour for this talk, I better get started straight away. Let me start on a local point of interest. The late and much revered Dayan Gershon Lopyan, before he passed away, was asked, where he wanted to be buried. And he said, there's only one place. And that is next to the grave of Rabbi Eliezer Gordon in Edmonton. If those of us, or it's applies to nearly all of us, who knew Dan Lopkin, in a way, were not surprised, because his background was what you would call for a literature yeshiva background. He is an illustrious son of an illustrious father and a grandfather of Rabbi Lopkin. They came from the literature yeshiva background. And he wanted to be buried next to probably the person who had the biggest levaya in Anglo Jewry. So even levias that you've done to match the numbers, in terms of numbers. There were reputed to be 50,000 people at the levaya of the Eliezer Gordon in 1910. What was Rabbi Eliezer Gordon, who was the Rosh Hashiva of Telz, doing in London? The answer is, in 1908, there was a fire in the yeshiva, and the yeshiva was devastated. As you know, buildings in those times were mainly of wood, and it rampaged right through Telz. The yeshiva building was destroyed, and the yeshiva was in dire straits. And a little bit later on, he came here, and while he was here, he had a fatal heart attack and died at the age of 68. And he came here, but for him it was new ground. Mishloachim generally didn't come to Anglo Jewry. They went to the Pale of Settlement, they went to Poland, they went to Lithuania, Germany, even the United States, and a few of them found their way to the United Kingdom, which was a shame for the United Kingdom because it was not so exposed to the great luminaries of Europe. And he came against doctors' advice because he had a heart condition, his wife, and he had a very cool reception here. Dr. Herman Adler, who was the chief rabbi at the time, didn't know that Telz was still operating. He thought it was closed. And on Motzoi Shabbat, he had a meeting, I don't know where, which shul or where, but he had a very cool reception. And it hurt him very, very deeply. That night, he had a heart attack, fatal heart attack, and he passed away. So who was he? I remember Dayan Aloni, the late Dayan of Dublin, coming to Gateshead Yeshiva, and when we had a guest, it was a relief. A bit of variety, a good hesped was always very interesting, and Dayan Aloni didn't come for a hesped, but he came. And I remember, you're long after you forget what people say, you remember how they looked, the way that they conveyed. Remember Dayan Aloni trying to convey to us what was the atmosphere in the yeshiva, in pre-war yeshivas. And I remember him saying a phrase, it was Maimed HaSinai Mamish. He said, you were standing at Har Sinai. And those who painted a picture portrait of Rabbi Eliezer Gordon, you can just picture the atmosphere in his shir. And some of you may remember the later Zalman Kosovsky. We will remember Salman very well. He was your colleague in Kenton. His grandfather, Rabbi Yitzchok Kosovsky, who was a Talmud of Rabbi Eliezer Gordon, in 1898, he was there in Slobodka, and he described the sight of Rabbi Eliezer Gordon speaking in a shir. He said he had an abnormal emotional capacity. All his limbs trembled. His sparks of fire came from his mouth. The shurim took at least 2 hours. You can complain about a long sermon. He was disconnected from the world. He forgot himself. All his emotions and personality were concentrated in his Chidushei Torah at enormous speed. Questions fired at him from all sides. If a question was not appropriate, the anger on his face, that he appeased this questioner very, very quickly. He was a soft-hearted man. He used to come down from the dais, from the Omud, and do battle with his Talmidim. And after the shir, he was transformed into another personality. And after 50 years, the late Rav Thurber, who was Rav in Dean Street, said that he has never had an experience like that in his life. Thurber, in fact, rubbed shoulders with many, many personalities. He was born in 1841 near Vilna. He was a Talmid of Reb Chaim Volozhin. He learned in Zeretz Yeshiva in Vilna. Then he went to Kovna. He was a Talmid of Rabbi Yisroel Salanta, the founder of the Mussar movement, who told him, your job is not to learn Mussar. He said, your job is to be Mechadish Chidushei Torah. He said, your talent, don't learn Mussar. He was a Talmid of Rabbi Yisroel's Talmidim, the late Rabbi Itzel Petterberger, Rabbi Yitzchak Blaser, Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam. His father-in-law, Rabbi Avrom Yitzchak Nevaiser, was the Rav of Kovna, and he kept him in learning. And he told him that he must not accept any of the positions that were offered to him. He was offered many. He said, "You learn." Rabbi Elazar's mother-in-law wasn't so enamored with this, and he said it was about time he got a job. And his father-in-law said, "You don't know who is supporting him. Are we supporting him, or is he supporting us?" And Rabbi Leib Gurvitz, the Rosh Yeshiva of Gateshead, said, in fact, told somebody when in fact he accepted his first position as Rav of Slobodka. At that moment, his father, just a few days later, his father-in-law died at his front doorstep, and his mother-in-law said, "You were correct. He was the one supporting us, not the other way around." He succeeded his father-in-law in Kovna. He was Rav of Kelm, not Chelm, don't mix the two up, in 9 years. And he came to Slobodka to learn for 6 months. And he became, in 1877, the Rosh Yeshiva of Telz. He took over, he was a colleague of Nosson Tzvi Finkel, who was known as the Alter of Slobodka. And he arrived actually, not in 1870, he arrived in 1884. He revolutionized the yeshiva. He divided the yeshiva into what you wouldn't call really a modern educational institution. It was divided into 5 graduated shiurim. He moved away from learning acharonim, later commentaries, and concentrated on the basics, on the rishonim. He railed against pilpul learning. He said we have to get down to basics. Sorry, other and his Magidei Shir in the yeshiva were household names from Shimon Shkop, Rabbi Yosef Leib Bloch, who became his son-in-law, and his successor. He introduced very strict regime of tests every Rosh Chodesh based on the sugya. And the way he did it was very imaginative. He set up 2 Talmidim, one against the other. He said, right, we've got 2 opinions in this Gemara. You're going to defend this opinion, and you're going to defend that opinion. Off you go in front of everybody, and let battle begin. And then at the end, he said, I want you to deliver a psak, a decision, a halachic decision on the basis of and he became a model for other yeshivas. His Talmidim were in awe of him. Ponovitch Rav, Rabbi Lezer Kahneman, he was in awe of Tzvi Ferber, Rabbi Zalman Sorotsky, and Rabbi Yosef Leib Bloch. And just to give you, I just looked just where I was davening, I picked up this sefer, the Sdei Chemed. And it's interesting, Sdei Chemed was virtually one of the first Jewish encyclopedias. It was written by Rabbi Chizkiyahu Chaim Chitzkiyahu Medini. And it's an amazing work. I mean, these works didn't have computers, right? It was all done from rigorous academic research and memory. They knew it in their minds. Anyway, he wrote, he didn't care what he said, basically, Rabbi Gordon. He didn't care what he said. He wrote to him because he got into trouble with Medini for calling his Sefer Sedei Chemed, because Shin Daled Yud, how dare you? You write the same word. Shin Daled Yud, you're not allowed to pronounce it. You say Shakai. And he defended him. He said, what rubbish? I mean, if you use that expression, excuse me. But he said that although the Shulchan Aruch says that if you write the Shem Hashem, even not with Kedusha, it is still called Kadosh. But he said, are you going to say that, Vayedaber Hashem El Moshe Lema, that the El is Kadosh, right? Not at all. It depends on the Kavanah. And therefore, he says, you're quite right. It's a phrase from Yeshayahu. Quite right. He said, you call your name your Sefer Sedei Chemed, but don't worry about anybody else. So this was the type of person that he was. Let me just give you a flavor of what happened with him. There were big controversies in the literature yeshiva world at the time about the introduction of Musa through the influence of Rabbi Yisroel. Many of the students thought this was a distraction from learning. This is not what yeshiva is supposed to be. But Rabbi Yisroel introduced the idea that yeshiva is not there just for the academic development, it's for character development. The Talmud Chacham has to be a whole person. But it was a major issue. And Telz was not immune from rebellion. And Bochurim, some hot-headed Bochurim, actually virtually caused the yeshiva to close for a while. And it cost him his health. Anyway, he was not without a sense of humor. Jeffrey Rabbi Schuster will love this one, because he appealed to the community for funds for the yeshiva. And the community had some wealthy people. Anyway, they turned him down flat. He was very, very upset. Comes before Rosh Hashanah, he heard that the community had hired a very expensive cousin. And so maybe it was you. But anyway, a very expensive chazan. And so he thought it was load, words to that effect. So he went, he said, I'd like to come along and give a drosha. So he said, and he came along and he said, to the Kehillah, he said, in the Midbar, they had absolutely everything. They had the manna from heaven, they had the meat, slav, and everything, but they all complained the whole time. He said, how come, he said, they never complained? How come they never asked for a chazan? Why didn't they say, we need a chazan? So he says, I'll tell you. So the shul that he went to was the tailor's shul, the Schneider's shul, right? It was full of Schneiders. So he went there. He said, I'll tell you why they didn't ask for a chazan. Because one of the miracles in the Midbar was Simloscha levolsa me'alecha. The clothes grew with them. So he said they had their clothes growing. He said they didn't need any new clothes. They didn't need any tailors. And since they didn't need any tailors, they obviously didn't need a chazan either. That put them in their place. Anyway, back to 1910. 1910, he passed away. There was an article written, and I haven't located it, by the late Judge Gerber, who remarkably said that he came to London, he met three people. One of them was Rav Werner, who was the Rav of Maxi, and I think, in the East End. And there were two others. And remarkably, these three people met, and in each case it was unfinished business, because Rav Werner, he was picked for the post in Telz by Rav Gordon, and Rav Werner, although he never held it against Rav Gordon, but it pinned him. He never got that position, and he was able. If he needed to make shalom, I don't know, but he came and he met Rav Werner. And there were two other people as well. It was unfinished with. During that short visit to London, before he was nifter, very suddenly, he met these three people and cleared the evidence. His levaya was not without controversy, because Dr. Adler, at that time, there were only reverends in the jury, and the only rabbi was the chief rabbi. What do you therefore put? How would you advertise about the Gadol Hadori was virtually Rav Gordon? So the levaya was delayed a little bit, but on the 4th of Adar in 1910, the levaya took place at Edmonton and is reputed to have had, the streets were thronged, all the Yidden of the East End and beyond. They came from the province. 50,000 people followed the Oron. People were hanging out of windows on balconies. The scene is, and the Talmidei Chachamim of Anglo jury gathered. There was, it so happens, the Radvaz from Tzfat was in the country. He went to the levaya. There was Rav Mendelssohn from Glasgow, Rav Horowitz from Sunderland, the late Rav Aaron Volkin of Manchester gave a hesped in Manchester, Shmuel Yaakov Rabinovitz from Liverpool, Rabbi Yoel Herzog from Leeds, and the most moving hesped came from Rabbi Hillman in Glasgow, who was later Diane Hillman. And they say it was because of this hesped that he came to people's attention in Zion that he was. He's the father-in-law of the chief rabbi, Rabbi Yitzchok Levi Herzog, and the great-grandfather, or the great-grandfather of the present Nasi of Yisroel of Yitzchok Herzog. And he gave a hesped which shook people to their roots. He said he looked around and he saw windows, streets, roofs, thousands of people, and tears like he'd never seen before. Tears from people who'd never met Rabbi Eliezer Gordon, but knew of his reputation. And in his hesped, he repeated the words of Yosef. When Yosef came out of prison, when he was in prison, and he met the butler and the baker, and they asked him, "Who are you?" And he said fateful words. He said, Ki gunov gunavti me'eretz Hebrew. He said, I've been stolen away from the land of the Hebrews. V'gam po lo osisi mu'umo. And here in Egypt, I haven't found any success. Somu osi babo. Look what they've done to me. And he said, this is what we've done to the rest of the Hebrew. Came me'eretz Ivrim. Where was the focal point, the focal point of gravity of world Jewry at the time? It was in Lithuania and Poland and the Pale of Sap. He was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews. And how did we treat him here? We didn't give him the respect that he was due. And now look where he ends up. He ends up with this. And the people were moved enormously by these words. And to this day, people come from all over the world to go to that Matzeva in Edmonton Cemetery. I would suggest that if you take the time, it's worthwhile going. As the inscription on the grave is both in Hebrew and in English, and it's one of the most illustrious points of pilgrimage, if you like. And people come from abroad and they say, where's Rabbi Eliezer Gordon? You need to go to see Rabbi Eliezer Gordon. So it's an ohel there. People, their candles virtually lit the whole time. And on his yacht side, particularly on Daladada, 4th of Adar, a large crowd. It's a sad event in the history of Anglo Jewry. But we had the zuchus of him being here at the end. Sadly, where's his Torah? His Torah doesn't exist. It was all destroyed in the First World War. All his kisvei yad. But the question is, what is a person's legacy in Torah? Does it need books on the shelf, svarim on the shelf? There are many svarim, right, that have been written that gather dust. But the greatest svarim that you can have are the Talmidim. Talmidim and his legacy live on to this day. That's a portrait of Rabbi.
Here's one of these big,
Yeah,
great.
yeah. It's interesting. People have asked that. I haven't found anything to suggest it wasn't. I mean, it's Gordon, Gimel, Vav, Reish, Daled, Vav, Nun. That's how it was. I don't know what the origin was, but there was a famous Ger who was Gordon. I mean, it didn't come from Gerim, but yeah.
Where was that?
And if you Pels was in Lithuania, but if you want to know, there is a great granddaughter, or great great granddaughter in London. Many of you may know Louise Braham, who's the long-standing, I don't know what the title is, administrator of Yisroel. She is, and Dan Lopian, when she used to come in, used to stand up before the great granddaughter.
Okay, great. Thank you very, very much for joining us this morning. By fine again. I will switch off the Zoom now. So those on Zoom, goodbye. We'll see you all next week, and then we'll finish the proceedings off here in the shul. Okay. Zoom comes off.